Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a historic set review for Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth. So this is going to be the next set that drops on Arena. I believe it comes out on the 20th, so it's going to be out next week. And this set is going to be legal in Historic and Alchemy only, so not legal in Standard, not legal in Explorer, but I'm really excited for this set. I think there's a bunch of really sweet cards in it, and it's going to have an impact in both formats as well, I think. So in this video, I'm only going to be covering Historic. I think there's too many cards to cover both Historic and Alchemy in the same video. It'd just be way too long. I am going to be doing an Alchemy set review later in the week, so hold tight for that. But in this video, what I've basically done is gone through the entire spoiler and just picked out any cards that I think are likely to see play in Historic. Starting off with the cards that I think are more powerful and more likely to have a bigger impact, and then we'll gradually work our way towards the more fringe cards as we go. So let's just get straight into it. Starting off here with Flowering of the White Tree, which I think is an incredibly pushed enchantment. Getting a buff of +2/+1 and Ward 1 to all your legendary creatures is so good for 2 mana, and you also just get a regular Anthem effect for your non-legendary creatures as well. Now, the obvious two drawbacks of this is that it's legendary and it costs double white, so it being legendary does mean that running 4 copies is a bit of a drawback if you don't have any looting effects, because drawing it in multiples can be awkward. And the annoying thing about that is that for this to be worth it, you obviously have to build your deck around it. You have to run a bunch of legendary creatures in order to get this payoff. So there is a little bit of tension there, but you can easily just run looting effects, right? There's a bunch of homes that I've thought of that could easily fit looting effects in just to get rid of additional copies that you draw. So there's definitely ways you can work around that. Even in builds without looting effects, you know, this seems like a powerful enough card where it could just be correct to run 4 copies just because finding the first copy is so important. And then the restriction of being double white is a drawback as well. Obviously, you can run it in 1 or 2 colours, and I think you can probably get away with 3 colours as well with the mana base we have access to. Probably need to run Mana Confluence to enable it, but definitely think you can run 3 colours for sure. In terms of 4 or 5 colours, I think that's probably pushing it a little bit too much. You know, Joda the Unifier would be another nice payoff to play alongside this, but I just don't think the mana is good enough in Historic to enable that. In terms of homes that I've thought this could fit into, the first home that I thought of was just red-white aggro with a bunch of legendary creatures, because I think red-white has the best legendary creatures for an aggressive deck. So for example, we've got Karizev Skyship Raider, which is super powerful with Flowering, because not only does Karizev get the buff, but the 2/1 that it creates also gets the buff as well, so you can force through a ton of damage with this. And then there are also a couple of other cards in this set that go well alongside Flowering. So first of all, we've got Frodo Sauron's Bane, which is another nice 1-drop in addition to it. So, you know, 1 mana 1/2 is fine, but then you can pump extra mana in this to turn it into a 2/3 with lifelink, which then, if you have Flowering, goes up to a 4/4 lifelink. So Frodo is a nice addition because I don't feel we have that many great options for the 1-drop slot. And if you're running an aggro deck, you obviously want to be running 1-drops as well. So Frodo, really nice addition. And then if you are in red-white, there's also this new card, Merry Esquire of Rohan, which is a 2/2 with haste that also gets a bonus when it's equipped, which is not really relevant for this particular archetype anyway. But if it attacks alongside another legendary creature, you get some card advantage, which seems pretty good. So this seems like a nice addition if you're running red-white. The other big appeal to red-white to me is that it has really good looting effects, so you get stuff like Ambergris, for example, which is just generically good in aggro that allows you to refuel your hand once you've, you know, emptied it with a bunch of creatures. Also enables you to pitch any additional copies of Flowering that you draw as well, which is nice. You can also run Seasoned Pyromancer for a similar effect. Now, obviously, that's not legendary, but, you know, the fact that you also get an Anthem effect for your non-legendary creatures means that you can get away with some non-legendary creatures, and Seasoned Pyromancer seems really nice as just a way to refuel, you know, as a way to dig, as a way to pitch additional copies of this. And the other thing about this card is that because you do need to build around it, I don't think you can just rely on Flowering of the White Tree, right? I don't think it makes sense to just run a deck of legendary creatures and Flowering, because there's going to be a decent number of games where you don't draw the first copy. There's going to be a decent number of games where the opponent has an answer to it, for example. So I think for this card to be effective, you need to be running another payoff as well. And in red-white, you could easily just run something like Embercleave as well. So you could just run a legendary aggro deck with Flowering and Embercleave as nice top-end cards, which seems pretty reasonable to me. In terms of other homes, like I mentioned, I don't think you need to be running all legendary creatures because you get a buff on your non-legendary creatures as well. So I think humans could potentially be a good home for this as well, because there's a bunch of good legendary humans, you know, stuff like Thalia, Adeline. If you go into white-black, you get stuff like the new Jarina and General Kudro as well. And then you could also just run a couple of non-legendaries like Esper Sentinel and Thalia's Lieutenant as just, you know, nice synergy pieces, as extra payoffs for running the Humans tribe as well, and this could fit nicely into that as well. And then in Historic, we also get some nice additions like Captain Aberheart, which is a card that I've always felt was powerful, but largely gets outclassed by the other human options that we have access to. But in a legendary creatures matter deck, this is really sick because, not only is it just a generically powerful card, but if you have Flowering alongside it, it becomes a 3/3 double strike, which is so powerful for 2 mana. And then you also get this nice passive ability as well, so I think it could fit nicely into humans. And then another home I was thinking of that it could fit into is potentially Esper Greasefang, which is already a deck that's running a bunch of legendary creatures as well. So you can run Esper Centaur, you can run Skrelv, you can run Thalia, you can run Rona as well, and then obviously stuff like Rafine in order to set up your Greasefang and just loot away additional copies of this as well. And then you could also run legendary creatures like Clement that I think work well in that deck. This Specialize is another way that you can potentially pitch Parhelion, so could work well with Esper Greasefang. And then obviously with Crucius dominating the format, you could run a Mardi build. You could potentially run Mardi Greasefang with Goblin Engineer, although you do have slightly worse legendary creatures for an aggro deck in that archetype, but with how powerful Crucius is, I'm sure some people will try and find Mardi builds as well. So either way, I think this is an incredibly powerful card, and I'm definitely going to bring around it a lot once the set drops. And next up we've got Reprieve, which is a card there's been a bunch of buzz about, and for good reason. So this is essentially a white remand, right? It's basically a counterspell in white that buys you tempo and draws you a card. So first time that people have been talking about this in is Control, and I do think this could potentially fit into Control. I think Control in Historic in general, or the way I've been trying to build it, has been moving more towards tempo, just because the format is very fast and you want to buy yourself time to get to your end game. So I've been running stuff like Divine Purge and Soul Partition over permanent answers to stuff. So to play along with that game plan, I definitely could see Reprieve fitting in there. Now, I'm not 100% sure that Control is the best home for this, because I've played with Memory Lapse in the past quite a lot, and there have been situations where if the opponent has a must-answer threat, delaying it for one turn isn't that big a deal. But with Change the Equation and Archmage's Charm, you could run a pretty high density of counterspells in the deck. Now again, that brings up another problem where you have to fit in a bunch of stuff. Like I said, I think Change the Equation is incredibly well positioned in Historic right now. You obviously want to be running Archmage's Charm as well, and so fitting all 3 of these cards in the deck is going to be quite difficult. It's going to be interesting to try and build it. But the other home I'm very interested in for this card is in the sideboard of either combo decks or just decks that want to protect their board state. So the first deck that comes to mind for me is Hammer Time. So Hammer Time was a deck that gets hated out very hard by specific cards like Divine Purge and Brotherhood's End, and I felt like even in Bant colours, you don't really have great answers for it. So for example, in my original builds of Hammer Time, I was running Spell Pierce to try and stop Divine Purge and Brotherhood's End, but that wasn't really that effective because against the red-black mid-range decks, they have Crucius and Fable that can produce a bunch of treasures, so by the time they cast Brotherhood's End, they can almost always pay the 2 on Spell Pierce in order to force through the Brotherhood's End. And then stuff like Loran's Escape is good at protecting your hammer or your key creature, but the rest of your board gets destroyed. So Reprieve, even though it's 1 mana more expensive, which is a big deal compared to something like Spell Pierce or Loran's Escape, it does seem like the kind of card that a deck like Hammer Time was really wanting. A hard, counter spell to stop that card. Although having said that, if you are against a red-black mid-range deck and they do have a bunch of treasures, there's a chance they can just immediately recast the Brotherhood's End if they have 6 mana at that point anyway. So not 100% sure about Hammer Time, but just in general, I think there are combo decks like Hammer Time that would be interested in running this in the sideboard. White definitely hasn't had access to this sort of thing outside of Mana Tithe, which is very specific. So I could definitely see, the white artifact synergy decks or just generally white combo decks in future wanting this as well. So either way, definitely a game-changing card in Historic. Giving white access to this sort of effect is pretty huge. So definitely expect this to see play either in white sideboards or in Control going forwards. And next up we've got Rosie Cotton of South Lane. So mainly interested in this one because it's just a 2-card combo with Scurry Oak. So the way this works is if you have Scurry Oak in play and you cast Rosie Cotton, it creates a food token which triggers the other ability, which then enables you to put a +1/+1 counter on the Scurry Oak. Then doing that makes the Scurry Oak create a 1/1 token, which then triggers Rosie again. So it's essentially just a 2-card version of the Heliod combo, right? You can just go off, make infinite 1/1s, make Scurry Oak infinitely large, and then just attack for lethal the following turn. Now the one downside is you don't gain infinite life, so say you're dead on board to wizards and they have a bunch of flies, that doesn't get you there, but a 2-card combo is so much better than a 3-card combo, and these are both hittable off Collected Company, they're both hittable off Kyle's Reconstruction, so very scary combo for sure. Now, the first thing is, people have been talking about this in the Heliod combo deck, and I'm not actually sure that Rosie fits very well in Heliod combos, so the awkward thing about Heliod combo at the moment is that Scurry Oak is kind of the odd card out, right? This card just doesn't synergize very well with the rest of the deck. If you don't have Heliod in play, then this doesn't really work with your life gain enablers, it doesn't really work with your Voice of the Blessed or Trelasara at all. And the same is true with Rosie. Rosie just doesn't work very well unless you have exactly Scurry Oak in play. And so I don't think this works particularly well in the Heliod combo deck. Like, you could obviously just, maybe cut Skyclave Apparition and put in Rosie just to increase your hits off Collected Company or Kyle's Reconstruction, but I feel if you do that, you're going to end up in a lot of situations where you have Life Gain Enablers and Rosie, and it just doesn't really do anything. And I think the big weakness of that deck is, against the interactive decks, like the mid-range decks, it's very easy for them to pick your synergies apart, and so running more cards that don't synergize well with other parts of your deck is going to lead to more situations where you get unlucky with that. One situation I can think of where this could work well in Heliod combo though is if you run Grizzled Huntmaster. So I've run Grizzled Huntmaster in Heliod combo in the past, and it worked reasonably well, but it slowed down the deck a little bit because you have to tutor for stuff. But I could potentially see Grizzled Huntmaster in this style of deck where you can just run a single copy of Rosie Cotton in your sideboard, and then if you have a situation where you have a Scurry Oak in play, you can cast the Grizzled Huntmaster or hit it off a Collector Company or whatever, then exile a creature from your hand and just tutor Rosie Cotton into your hand to then combo off. But outside of that, you could run this in any number of decks. You could run it in a food shell. There's a list I've been brewing that I'll talk about a little bit later when I get to Samwise Gamgee, where you could run this alongside Animation Module and Ashnod's Altar combo, which has already worked well with Yotian Dissident, where you can essentially just make infinite tokens and make them infinitely large with these two cards together. And then Rosie Cotton of South Lane essentially acts as, additional copies of Yotian Dissident for that combo. And then if you're running a bunch of food synergies and Yotian Dissident, that just works well with Scurry Oak anyway, where you can just put counters on Scurry Oak if you've got a fair game plan going on. So Rosie Cotton could fit well alongside Animation Module Ashnod's Altar. You could also just run this in a +1/+1 counter synergy deck as well. You could also just run it in a food synergy deck. So a lot of different ways to build it. I'm not sure this fits perfectly well into Heliod combo, but I think there's a lot of ways that you could build this, and having just a 2-card combo, specifically one that you can hit off Collected Company, is definitely a big deal. And, I definitely expect this to see play going forwards. And the next up, we've got Orcish Bowmasters. So this is an incredibly powerful card. So this is, we've obviously seen two mana cards that produce another body when they enter play see play in the past, right? Lazotep Reaver sees play in sacrifice decks, and this is by far and away the best version of that we've ever seen. So first of all, it has flash, so it makes it better than Lazotep Reaver immediately. It pings something when it enters play, which is really good, and it can hit any target, so you can pick off a Land or Elves, you can pick off a Dragon's Rage Channeler, so that's great as well. So it's a, 2 bodies, picks off a creature, and then you also get additional triggers every time the opponent draws outside of their draw step. And because this has flash, you can flash this in response to a Seasoned Pyromancer, deal 3 to any target, and get a 3/3 in play alongside the 1/1. And then, there's a bunch of decks that draw a lot. If you get this in play against Auras, for example, they have no way of dealing... Well, if they can't kill the Orcish Bowmasters, you're just going to be gunning them down because their whole game plan revolves around drawing cards. Of course, Spirit Dancer against like Phoenix or Wizards, where they draw a bunch of cards, this is going to be doing a ton of damage. So initially I was thinking, okay, this is a super powerful card on rate, best style of effect that we've had of this in a long time. So, but I'm not sure it had a great home because, you probably want to be running this in a sacrifice deck to make use of the extra body. But the more I think about this, the more I think that it could just see play, maybe even in Rakdos mid-range at the 2-drop slot, because obviously stuff like Bloodtithe Harvester is good, Shieldred's Assimilator is good in the right metagame as well, but the 2-drop slot is definitely the most lacking, and this feels like potentially powerful enough that it could just slot into the main deck there. Even if it doesn't, even if you do need slightly more synergy for this to work, this is a really, really sick sideboard card against any deck that's drawing a bunch of cards, but I wouldn't be surprised if this starts seeing play in main decks. And, especially in decks that can make use of the orcs, right? If you are running a sacrifice synergy deck, which, sacrifice hasn't been popular in a while, but we are getting a new combo alongside food, I could see this seeing play. So yeah, I expect this one to see a lot of play. It's very powerful generically. If you can use the orcs to sacrifice, it's really good. If there's a lot of 1 toughness creatures in the format, this is an absolute all-star. So yeah, I expect this one to see a lot of play. Very, very excited about this one. The next one, we've got Delighted Halfling. So we're getting a new mana dork, and this one is really interesting. So it can either produce colorless or mana of any color, which can be spent, which if you do spend it on a legendary spell, it can't be countered, which is really huge. So there are two main homes that I'm excited for this immediately. First of which is Mono Green Devotion. So obviously that's a deck I've been working on a lot recently, and this is basically just a strict upgrade on Avacyn's Pilgrim in that deck. So Pilgrim essentially worked as the third mana dork in that deck, which I think is a really big deal when you have Leyline of Abundance, and this is just much better because outside of, flipping Polukranos, you never really have any use for the white mana, so the fact that this produces colourless basically just makes it as useful as Avacyn's Pilgrim, and then the fact that it can make your Kioras and your Khans uncounterable is really huge. And then on top of that, the other nice thing about this card is that it also enables you to cast Polukranos on turn 2 and is uncounterable as well. One of the drawbacks of running Avacyn's Pilgrim is it made running the triple green 3-drop slightly more awkward, because it meant that unless you had Leyline of Abundance, you couldn't use them to cast stuff like Polukranos on turn 2, whereas since it's legendary, this can, and I think Polukranos is probably the most appealing of the triple green 3-drops to play, because it really improves your matchup against a deck like Wizards, for example. So I definitely expect this to just replace Avacyn's Pilgrim. And then the other interesting thing about this is that I think it could, you could potentially build a deck in a way where you have more than 12 mana dorks, right? Now with Delighted Halfling alongside Avacyn's Pilgrim, you could potentially run 14 or even 16 one-mana mana dorks. Now, I think 16 is probably too much, but I could definitely see an argument for 14. Maybe cut the Forceful Cultivators and then run more top ends. So either way, I think this is a great addition to Devotion for sure. And then the other home I'm thinking of with this is potentially Yawgmoth combo, which is a deck that has wanted more mana dorks for a while, and it is a little bit awkward that it produces colourless for, some of your plays which require green or black mana, but the fact that this can be used to cast Yawgmoth and make it uncounterable is pretty huge, because from my testing in Yawgmoth, it does seem weakest to control, so making your Yawgmoth uncounterable is huge. Playing Tyvar on turn 2 that's also uncounterable is pretty huge, so fits pretty well in Yawgmoth, and just in general, this is a really useful mana dork if you are running a lot of legendary creatures, and especially if you're struggling against counter spells. This seems huge. So mainly excited immediately for Devotion and Yawgmoth, but I definitely think this is going to be an important card going forwards in general anyway. Next up, we've got Flame of Anor. So this is a new kind of a command style effect that seems really good to me. So you either draw 2, destroy an artifact, or deal 5 to target creature. And if you control a wizard, you pick 2. So first of all, at its base, 3 mana draw 2 at instant speed is a really good floor to have access to. We've seen from Archmage's Charm that just being able to draw 2 at worst is really big. Destroying an artifact is going to be super relevant in Historic basically all the time, right? There's been artifact decks in the format for ages. There's obviously a lot of sideboard artifacts that people bring in. And then the main thing I'm really excited for with this card is the deal 5 to target creature is huge because of Shieldred. I feel like the red decks have been really struggling to find a good answer to Shieldred for a long time now, right? There's obviously a bunch of other 3-mana deal 5s, but all of them only deal 5, and they're not that great outside of that. So having a flexible card that can also kill Shieldred is really big. So obviously because of the wizard bonus, the main home I'm thinking of immediately for this is it Wizards, and I definitely think this is going to slot into that deck fairly well. Now, because it is 3 mana, I'm not sure you want to be running that many. You could run 2, although having said that, I think it's powerful enough that in the 75 you probably want to be running 4 copies for the matchups like against the Shieldred decks for sure. And then you can fairly easily bump Dreadhorde Arcanist's power to 3 using Symmetry Sage, which then enables you to cast this from the graveyard with Arcanist. So I'm really excited to try this in Wizards, and I'm definitely going to run at least 2 copies in the main deck, maybe even more than that in the 75, because being able to have a flexible card that can kill Shieldred is huge, and obviously the Artifact Destruction mode is very relevant on this as well, so definitely a big card to get access to in Wizards. And then even outside of that, I could see this seeing play in just Izzet control decks in general. So one of the issues I was having with a deck like Creativity, for example, is that you didn't really have great ways to deal with Shieldred. Like, you obviously can counter it, but sometimes it's not going to line up like that. So having this as a way to deal with Shieldred that also is flexible as well is great. Now, specifically in Creativity, the fact that this doesn't produce treasures is a little bit annoying, but I still think it could fit well into, just Izzet control decks that need a way to kill Shieldred. So definitely excited to try this one out. Going to be a big addition to Wizards, I think. Next up, we've got Samwise Gamgee. So this is just a generically powerful card in a food shell, but mainly interested in this because it introduces a new combo to Historic where you can win with this alongside Cauldron Familiar and a free sacrifice outlet. So generically powerful card in its own right. You know, if you're running a food deck, so if you're running this alongside Trail of Crumbs, this is just a really nice way to repeatedly produce food for 2 mana, which is really nice. But like I said, the main combo with it is Cauldron Familiar. So the way this works is, if you have Samwise Gamgee and Cauldron Familiar and a free sacrifice outlet, say like Woe Strider or Yawgmoth, for example, then you just sacrifice the Cauldron Familiar, you cast the Cauldron Familiar, triggers Samwise Gamgee, which creates a food token. You sacrifice the Cauldron Familiar to the Woe Strider or the, whatever free sacrifice outlet you've got. It goes to the graveyard. Then you can sacrifice the food that you made off Samwise Gamgee to bring back the Cauldron Familiar, drain the opponent for 1. Then the Familiar entering the battlefield triggers the Samwise again to make another food, and then you can just loop it over and over again. So the really nice thing about this combo to me is that all of the combo pieces are generically powerful in their own right? Samwise Gamgee works really well in a food shell. Cauldron Familiar, I mean, the drawback of this is Cauldron Familiar is obviously nerfed, so the fact it can't block does make it less generically powerful than it was before, but Cat Oven Trail is still a strong engine, and one of the big weaknesses of those food decks in the past was that they take a long time to close the game out, which makes you naturally weak to opposing combo decks, makes you naturally weak to control because you just give them time to find Divine Purge and Farewell. But the fact you have your own combo to shut the game out is really, really huge. So even though Cauldron Familiar is nerfed, I definitely think this has the potential to be very strong. Now, I've thought of a few homes for this. So the first home I thought of was just a generic food deck with stuff like Woe Strider. You could potentially run Tyvar and Fiend Artisan, or maybe even like Tyvar and Priest of Forgotten Gods alongside Orcish Bowmasters, because I think Bowmasters plus Priest is a really sick synergy. So you could just run a very pure food deck, Deadly Dispute, Fatal Push, stuff like that. Very low to the ground. But one other home that I've been thinking of that I was kind of alluding to a little bit earlier, it's kind of hard to fit everything in, but I think this sort of food package could fit well alongside animation module Ashnod's Altar and potentially Rosie Cotton and Scurry Oak if you can fit it in. But basically my thought process with this is that you need a free sacrifice outlet, which Ashnod's Altar works as. And then, with the food package, you'd want to run Cat Oven Trail, you'd want to run Gilded Goose and stuff like that. And so you could run Yotian Dissident and Rosie, so that when you're looping Cat Oven, you're getting a bunch of +1/+1 counters on stuff, which, is just generically powerful anyway. And then you also run Animation Module, which enables you to create tokens whenever you use your +1/+1 counters off Rosie or Yotian Dissident. And then you can also, which is just generically powerful anyway, right? If you have Yotian Dissident and Animation Module, for when you put a counter on something, you can just pump all of your mana into this to produce a bunch of produce a bunch of 1/1 tokens and get +1/+1 counters. Then if you pair that with Ashnod's Altar, you can go infinite to just make as many tokens as you want, or potentially make infinite mana as well. And then Ashnod's Altar also works as a free sacrifice outlet for the Cauldron Familiar to help you go off. Trail of Crumbs can find all of your pieces. Ashnod's Altar just seems like it works pretty well with Trail of Crumbs as well. So say you have Cauldron Familiar Trail and you don't have a Gilded Goose or a Witch's Oven, you can just sacrifice your Cauldron Familiar to the Ashnod's Altar, then pump that mana into the Trail of Crumbs in order to get a bunch of card advantage. So there are a lot of moving pieces, and it does seem quite hard to fit everything in, especially the Scurry Oak alongside Rosie. But this is definitely, it feels like there's a lot of redundancy and a lot of good cross synergy that I'm definitely going to be brewing this when the set comes out for sure. Then next up we've got Spiteful Banditry. So this is another really cool card that's basically the red Meat Hook Massacre, but instead of draining the opponent, or I guess the nerfed version doesn't do that anymore, but this basically produces treasure tokens whenever a creature dies. So this isn't going to fit in that many decks because you do need to be running a red deck that can produce a bunch of mana, but if you're running a big red deck, there have been big red decks in the past with Cleansing Wildfire or just producing a bunch of mana. This seems like a really great card there, but I'm also kind of interested in this in creativity, potentially as a flexible sweeper that also produces treasure tokens to help your creativity. Now, having said that, Brotherhood's End is a card that exists right now and is very well positioned because of the artifact decks. So, and, when I've built creativity, especially just blue-red in the past, I haven't wanted to main deck the Brotherhood's End because it has been a bit clunky, but the fact that this can produce treasures for your creativity is pretty interesting. So not 100% sure it does see play immediately, but this is definitely one that I've got my eye on going forwards, and definitely it has the potential to see play in Historic because it is basically a red Meat Hook Massacre, and the producing treasures, it is a hard once per turn obviously because otherwise it would just be absolutely insane, but producing treasures is very beneficial. and getting a treasure every single turn if you're killing creatures is pretty huge. So again, if maybe fits in creativity, maybe not, but either way, this is definitely one that's powerful enough to see play, and I've got my eye on it going forwards for sure. And then we've also got Dawn of New Age. So this is a pretty sick enchantment. So 2 mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, it has a hope counter on it for each creature you control. And then as long as it's got hope counters on it, you basically draw a card every single turn until the hope counters run out. So you want to be running this in a very go-wide aggro deck. I'm not 100% sure this sees play in the main deck at all, but I could definitely see this seeing play in the sideboard of go-wide aggro decks as just a repeatable source of card advantage. And then the really nice thing I'm excited about with this card in Historic is that you can loop it with Lurrus. So say you're running like the Lurrus Humans deck, for example, you could potentially get creatures out in the early game, get Dawn of a New Age out, and then just draw a bunch of cards every single turn. And then when it dies, later in the game, you can go Lurrus, get this back with Lurrus with a bunch of hope counters on, keep drawing over and over again. So I'm not really excited about this card if you're not running Lurrus, but if you're running a Lurrus aggro deck, this seems like a really great option to just enable you to, keep producing card advantage, stay in the game against grindy decks. Again, not sure if he's playing the main deck, but in the sideboard and Lurrus decks, very excited for this one. So next up we've got Forge Anew, which is a generically powerful enchantment, but I'm not sure it really has a great home in Historic right now. So the first thing I think of when I read this card is Hammer Time, because it's an equip cost reducer, but I don't think this really fits into existing builds of Hammer Time because they're very reliant on Lurrus. I don't think you'd want to give up Lurrus to run this. And also having your equip cost reducer be 3 mana as opposed to 1 or 2 is a really big difference. It's quite expensive, so I don't think it fits in Hammer Time. And the only other deck in Historic that's running equipments right now is Thopterblade, and I'm not sure this fits that well there either. It is good at buying equipments back from the graveyard, so maybe you could sideboard this against interactive decks, but you're already running Fervent Champion as a way to discount your equipment, so I'm not really sure it fits well, in that deck either. The main thing I'm keeping my eye on this card going forwards is in case Wizards print a really powerful and expensive equipment, and then you can use this as a combo card alongside Goblin Engineer, similar to how Greasefang works, where you could go Goblin Engineer on turn 2, pitch the really powerful equipment into the graveyard, and then on turn 3 you can go Forge Anew, bring it back, and then equip it because of the free equip costs and move it around for free. So I don't think Forge Anew has a good home right now, but if Wizards ever prints a really powerful, expensive equipment, this card is definitely going to be on my radar for sure. Speaking of Thopterblade, another card that I think could go well in Thopterblade is Frodo Determined Hero. So this is another card similar to Fervent Champion that you can equip equipment on for free essentially, and then it also allows you to freely attack because damage is prevented during your turn as well. Now, annoyingly, this was close to playable in Hammer Time. If it said value 1 to 3, then I think this would be an upgrade over Kemba, but because it says value 2 or 3, you can't really afford to run this in Hammer Time because not being able to equip Colossus Hammer is a huge drawback. But like I said, I definitely think you could run this in Thopterblade just for extra redundancy for your Fervent Champion style effect, so I'll definitely be trying it out in that shell for sure. The next up we've got Stern Scolding, which seems like a really interesting sideboard option for counter spells. So this is a really, really cheap, efficient counter spell for cheap creatures, right? This hits a lot of 1 and 2 drops, and also even more expensive cards in certain decks, right? The fact you could hit a 4 mana card like Yawgmoth is really big now. I think if you're running a colour with efficient removal like Fatal Push, this doesn't really seem worth it because it's a lot worse when you go second, right? The big appeal of Fatal Push is if the opponent plays a 1-drop out, you can still kill it immediately, whereas Stern Scolding is a lot better on the play. But if you're not running black, most other colours don't have that efficient removal. This seems like a potentially good option in the sideboard for counterspell decks for sure, right? It's basically the blue version of Fatal Push. Hits a lot of creatures at 1 or 2 mana. You're very happy if you can trade this up with a 2-drop, for example. But like I said, if you're running a colour with efficient removal like black, this is generally worse on the draw. So yeah, definitely an interesting sideboard card for sure going forwards. Could see it, in the sideboard of deck like blue-white control in certain metagames as well. So definitely keep this in mind for your blue sideboards going forwards. Then next up we've got Aragorn the Uniter. So I didn't really expect to be running a 4 mana, having a 4 mana creature that doesn't do anything on ETB on this list. We have seen from Shieldred that is sometimes playable, but the main reason I'm excited for this card in Historic is because of 5-color humans with Jodah the Unifier. So that's a deck that I've been brewing and kind of iterating on for a little while now, and Aragorn the Uniter seems really sick in that deck because 4 mana 5/5 is reasonable stats on rate, but then the fact you get all these additional bonuses whenever you cast a spell of that color is really sick. And the really powerful thing about this is it triggers each time on multicolored spells. So say you cast a Bant spell, green, white, blue, you get 3 of the triggers on this. You get the green, the white, and the blue trigger. So the main reason why I'm excited for this in Jodah decks is because we have a pretty high density of protection spells in that deck now. So if you're not familiar with basically the archetype I'm talking about is 5-color humans with, the mana base is workable because you've got Unclaimed Territory, you've got the Courtyard, you've got Mana Confluence and Plaza of Heroes. So you've got pretty good mana if you stick to humans specifically. And then in that archetype, you also have access to Jadar, the Bodyguard, and recently we got the addition of Jarina as well. So you have a pretty high density of ways to protect all of your creatures. So just, generically, I don't think this is good enough to see play, but specifically in that deck, because you have so many ways to protect your creature, you're much more likely to be able to untap with this. And then if you untap with it and you cast like a Lagrella the Magpie, for example, and you get 3 triggers off this immediately, it's very, very powerful. Now, the one downside of this card is that one of the benefits of running Jodah right now is that in current builds you can use Crucius to tutor for Jodah because you don't run anything at the 4-drop slot, and this would interfere with that slightly, but I think that's fine for the most part, right? You're pretty happy to tutor for this off Crucius anyway, and so I'm definitely going to be trying it out in that deck. I don't think you're really going to see it, have it see play elsewhere, but in 5-color humans with Jodah alongside Jadar, Jadar the Bodyguard and Jarina, Dauntless General. This seems like a really nice addition there, potentially. The next time we've got Éowyn, Fearless Knight, and this seems like a very powerful card. Again, I'm not sure it's going to see play in the main deck, but if you're in Boros colours and you need to be able to deal with bigger creatures, this seems huge because this is essentially a creature that exiles another creature permanently, right? We don't have the downside like Brutal Cathar where the opponent gets the creature back. We don't even have the downside of something like a Skyclave Apparition where the opponent gets a token when it dies. This just permanently exiles it, which is really huge. So not only do you get to exile something like a Shieldred or like an Atraxa or something, but you also get a reasonable threat on the battlefield as well. So this is quite a niche card, but if you are in red-white and you struggle against bigger creatures, this seems like an absolute killer card. Now again, you compare it to something like Ravenous Chupacabra, which is more generically useful, but that's double black, and this is in red-white, so again, very specific, but if you're after a card to deal with bigger creatures, this seems great. Next up, we've got Horn of the Mark. So similar to the white enchantment, this is another 2-mana card that's good at producing card advantage in aggro decks. I think you need to be running a very aggressive deck for this to be good. And the main reason I was thinking about this card is that I think it could potentially be good in Affinity, maybe, or like the artifact aggro decks, because those are decks where you swarm the battlefield very quickly. You've got 0-drops like Ornithopter, so it's very easy for you to start attacking. If you're running meta techs, you're already incentivized to be running flying creatures, stuff like Hope of Girpa and Vault Scourge in order to connect to get value off the meta text. So if you wanted additional card advantage, you could consider running this as a one-off there. You can hit it off Ingenious Smith. You can start getting creatures off the top of your library whenever you start attacking, which seems decent. My only reservation about this card is that the matchups where you would want it, I don't think you really want this in the main deck unless, you don't like meta text for whatever reason. So it would probably be a sideboard card for the more interactive decks or the grindier decks. And against those decks, if you are playing an artifact deck, you generally want ways to stop stuff like Brotherhood Zen and Divine Purge, stuff like Invasion of Gobekhan or Metallic Rebuke. So this might not make the cut because of that. Outside of that, you could consider also running it in decks like Convoke, maybe, that are very good at swarming the battlefield very quickly. So I think if this does see play, it's a sideboard card in very aggressive decks, but I think it's definitely worth trying. I'm definitely going to test it out in Affinity and see how it works. Then next up, we've got a couple of cards that potentially could see play in Wizards or maybe even Phoenix. Now again, I'm not 100% sure on these, but I'm definitely going to be testing it out. So these are Birthday Escape and Ranger's Firebrand. Birthday Escape, draw a card, the ring tempts you. Ranger's Firebrand, deal 220 target, and the ring tempts you. So the idea here is that the first stage of the ring tempts you makes the creature you pick legendary and can't be blocked by creatures that have a higher power than it. So the main reason why I'm excited for this in Wizards is that it works very well with Dreadhorde Arcanist, Soulscar Mage, and Symmetry Sage. So specifically Dreadhorde Arcanist, the downside of having to attack is problematic if the opponent has blockers in play, which is going to happen in a lot of matchups, right? Retrofit Foundry decks can make 4/4s. Devotion can get big creatures into play. There's a lot of decks that are capable of blocking your Dreadhorde Arcanist. And so using Birthday Escape as a cantrip that then makes your Arcanist essentially unblockable seems potentially very powerful. And then with Soulscar Mage and Symmetry Sage, they're both creatures that have a low power when they attack that you can then buff with instants. So, say you attack with a Soulscar Mage, if it's your Ring Bearer, it means the opponent can't block it with any creature that has power 2 or greater. Then you can just wait until after blocks, fire off some instants, and then boost its power. So it does seem like it has reasonable potential. Now, the obvious downside of these cards is that, Birthday Escape, if you compare it to Consider, it being sorcery speed and not providing any selection is definitely a drawback. And similarly, Ranger's Firebrand not being an instant and also not getting the Scry if you go face is a drawback as well. Now, the being sorcery speed as opposed to instant isn't as much of an issue because generally you want to be playing spells during your own turn anyway in order to trigger Symmetry Sage and Balmor and stuff like that. But the lack of card selection could mean that it might not be worth it. But either way, I'm definitely going to be testing it out. The other slight downside of these cards is that if you run them both together, you are running a lot of sorcery speed stuff, especially if you're also running like Expressive Iteration or Mentor's Guidance. And so the upside of making a Soulscar Mage or a Symmetry Sage essentially unblockable is less appealing if you're running less instants because, you can attack, but then you need to have instant speed stuff in order to boost its power after blocks, if that makes sense. So either way, I'm definitely going to be trying these out. Not 100% sure they'll be better than Consider or Play with Fire, but I feel like the Ring Tempts You could be very good, especially with Dreadhorde Arcanist. And then additionally, the second stage of the Ring Tempts You means that your Ring Bearer loots whenever it attacks, which could be useful in a deck like Is It Phoenix, but I'm less excited about that because in Phoenix, you generally run fewer threats anyway. You typically run 4 Ledger Shredder for DRC and then some number of Symmetry Sage. And making your Ledger Shredder legendary then means that you can't play any more copies of it. And you also have to get the Ring Tempts You twice in order to get the looting effect. So I think I'm definitely more excited for it in Wizards, but I could potentially see one of these two, or maybe even both, making the cut there. We'll definitely have to test it out and see. The next up, we've got the first land that I'm going to cover, and that is Minas Tirith. So there's this cycle of legendary lands that enter tapped unless you control a legendary creature. This is the only one that I think is really playable in Historic, but this is a potentially very powerful effect. So again, you need a very specific deck for this to be good. The flower decks, the enchantment that I covered earlier, the Anthem effect, I definitely think that those decks would be interested in running a single copy of this. If you can get it to enter play untapped most of the time, that's obviously, mitigating the drawback a lot. And then being able to pay 3 mana to draw a card, especially off a white land, is very powerful. We've seen how good Castle Locthwain can be. That's in black and a mana more expensive, and you lose life. So obviously you would need to be running an aggressive deck with legendary creatures, but as we talked on earlier, there could be new archetypes birthed by the new Anthem effect, and in those decks, this is definitely a good one of. So if you can enable this, this is a very, very powerful utility land for sure. The next up, we've got Mount Doom, which is slightly less exciting. It's basically a legendary red-black pain land that has some extra utility in that you can use it to deal damage to the opponent. And, if you get really in the late game, you can use this as kind of like a sweeper as well. So, again, I don't know how many decks are going to be that interested in this. If you're running Rakdos Burn, having access to this as additional damage is huge. I think the main place, or the main current archetype that we're most interested in this is Death Shadow, because that's a deck that obviously wants pain lands to deal damage to itself, and then you just get this added utility. So again, not a very exciting land, but there are definitely some decks that I could see being interested in this for sure. And then next up, we've got the One Ring, which is another card that is potentially interesting, but mainly in Khan Wishboards. I don't think there's any deck that really wants to be running this in the main deck. And again, Khan Wishboard targets are, it's very contested because there's not that much slots, and there's a lot of good artifacts that you can run in the Khan Wishboard. But I could potentially see this one seeing play. Now, I can't remember the name of it, but there was recently an artifact printed that basically gives you protection from everything for a single turn. So it's good at stabilizing you for a turn, giving you an extra draw step. But the main reason that card never saw play was because it didn't do anything else, right? You just play it, you buy yourself a turn, and then that's basically it. You've got to hope to draw well off the top. Whereas the big advantage of the One Ring is it buys you that extra turn and then also starts drawing you extra cards. So, it gives you more likelihood to find the out to the situation you're in. So I could definitely see this thing play in Calm Wishboards. Again, not 100% sure because it's quite contested, but I'm definitely going to be trying it out for sure. The next up, we've got Pippin, Guard of the Citadel, which is another, pretty powerful legendary creature. If this was a human, I would be way more excited about it because it, as another card that fits very nicely into the Jodo Humans deck, for example. Could run it in blue-white humans if you wanted to splash for Meddling Mage or something weird like that. But the fact it's a soldier is a bit of a drawback because it doesn't cleanly fit into the Jodo Humans deck, which would be the main home. I'm excited for it, but soldiers have been getting a lot of support recently. A lot of the good humans are already soldiers, like Esper Sentinel, Thalia's Lieutenant Thalia, for example. And so, Alongside Valiant Veteran, I could see this as another payoff for being in Soldiers potentially, and the fact that it can protect your other creatures and has Vigilance on Ward 1 itself is pretty decent. So if there is a Soldiers deck in Historic, I definitely think this is an upgrade for it. And, if you're just running a generic legendary aggro deck, like maybe you're running the new Anthem that we looked at earlier, if you're going for blue-white, this seems like a really good option there as well. So definitely a generically powerful card. Not sure it's got a great home right now, but could be a few decks that might be interested in this going forwards. And then we've also got Stone of Erech. I'm not sure how you say that one, but this seems like, I'm not sure it's going to see play right now, but it's definitely one to bear in mind. It's a good hate piece going forwards. If there are more decks that emerge like Yawgmoth that are, focused on looping stuff from the field to the graveyard over and over again. So, say for example the Samwise Gamgee combo with Cauldron Familiar becomes very popular. This seems like a really good hate piece there. So the static ability is what you're really interested in with this card. Like I said, shuts off Yawgmoth combo's ability to loop Young Wolf, shuts off Cauldron Familiar's ability to loop from the graveyard over and over again. Now right now, I think the best graveyard hate, or the best colourless graveyard hate, is Soulguide Lantern because of Kethis, and also Unlicensed Hearse as well. And the fact that you would have to hole open 2 mana to use this as graveyard hate means that I don't think you're very interested in running this over either of those two right now. But like I said, if the Samwise combo pops off, or Yawgmoth combo becomes a lot more popular, or just generally decks that are looping creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield over and over again, this seems like a really good option to bear in mind going forward for sure. So next up we've got Sauron's Ransom, which definitely seems like a generically powerful card to me. So 3 mana instant. Basically look at the top 4, opponent splits them into 2 piles, and you get to put 2 to go into your hand, 2 into the graveyard, and the ring tempts you, so a lot of value for 3 mana, especially if you've got a lot of graveyard synergies. My main concern with this card is that, spending your turn 3 on card advantage isn't something that many decks are very interested in, right? You're not developing to the board, really, so I think you would need a very specific deck, probably either a combo or control deck for this to be good, right? If you've got a control deck that has graveyard synergies, this seems good because you're playing it instant speed anyway, and if you, especially if you're running a graveyard-based combo deck, this seems pretty good. But like I said, outside of that, most 3 mana card advantage that's run right now is flexible. Stuff like Archmage's Charm that can also double up as interaction. So very powerful card, but I think it needs a very specific home to be, to be decent in Historic. The next up we've got Boromir, Warden of the Tower, which is another legendary human, 3/3 vigilance, and it has got kind of like a hate bear ability. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana is spent to cast it, you counter that spell. So basically the Lavinia line of text, which is not that relevant right now, right? The only deck that I can really think that this hits is like Kethis combo, right? It stops them casting Mox Amber, but you do get the added bonus that you can give all your creatures indestructible into the turn, and the ring tempts you as well. So that ability is very powerful for sure, but I think with the other text on the card, the counter ability on this not being that relevant right now, I'm not sure why you would choose to run this over something like Selfless Spirit or Jarina, for example. So I don't think this is going to see play right now, but if more combo decks appear which cast free spells, or more decks run free spells, this is definitely one to bear in mind going forwards for sure. And it obviously being a human soldier means that it can fit in humans, it can fit in soldiers as well, so not one I expect to see play right now, but definitely one to keep an eye on going forwards. And next up we've got Moria Marauder. So this is another interesting goblin. The annoying thing about this is I don't really think it fits very well into any of the current pre-existing goblin shells, and I think the 2-drop slot is the most stacked in goblins, right? We've got Munitions Expert, Battlecry Goblin, Runvolt Hallmaster. Then if you go into different colours, you've got like Goblin and Archamancer in the Revels build, for example. So for this to be viable, I think you would need to be running a very low to the ground aggressive deck with a lot of Lord effects, right? Double Strike gets a lot better if you have 4 Underworld Hallmaster, 4 Goblin Chieftain, for example, which my build of Rakdos Goblins, or the latest Crucius build, was running that. But again, I don't think this is better than any of the current 2-drops we're running. The main reason I wanted to highlight this, though, is that I've recently been, toying with the idea of potentially running Nykthos in Goblins as a way to ramp into Muxus without having to run a bunch of stuff like Goblin Warchief. And this, alongside Wily Goblin and Conspicuous Snoop, could mean you have enough double pip cards that a Nykthos Goblins deck, using Nykthos to ramp into Muxus and allow you to cast stuff off the top with Conspicuous Snoop, or pump all of your mana into Battlecry Goblin, could potentially be a way you build the deck. So again, not sure it really fits cleanly into the current Goblin shells, but it's definitely one bearing in mind if you either have a lot of Lord effects or you want to try and run Nykthos in Goblins. The next up we've got Arwen Undómiel. I think that's how you say that one. But this is another card that I don't think has a good home right now, but is a very potential, it's a cool build around basically. So there are a number of cards in this set that pay you off for scrying. And I think this is the most powerful one. So rather than showing all of them, a lot of which I'm not sure are historic playable, this is just one that I wanted to highlight just to, show that this is a potential archetype that you could build around. Again, I'm not sure it'll be good. I'm not sure it's good right now, but as more scry effects get printed, this sort of effects could be good. Like I said, there are a few others in this set as well. So I don't expect a scry synergy deck to be that powerful, but definitely something that I'm going to bear in mind going forwards as more scry effects and payoffs are added to the format. Next up, we've got Ioreth of the Healing House. So again, this is not a card that I think has a good home right now, but the main ability that really stands out to me here is tap to untap 2 other target legendary creatures. That seems, now again, I've looked for stuff and I haven't really found anything, but going forwards, this is definitely something to bear in mind, right? That seems like an incredibly powerful effect that could enable some combos. So not sure this has a good home right now, but definitely one to bear in mind going forwards. Similar sort of thing with this card, Scroll of Isildur. So this is a saga, 3-mana saga, so very cheap. And if there's good artifacts to steal in the format, this card seems very good because, chapter 1, steal an artifact, then tap 2 creatures and, stun them out so they can't untap again for the next turn cycle. And then you get to draw a card for each tap creature opponent controls. So the card is very good for 3 mana, but you need chapter 1 to have an impact on the game. And right now, I don't really think it does. Like, specifically against Affinity, you can steal their Retrofit a Foundry or something like that, which seems pretty good. Against Hammer, stealing their Hammer isn't that good if they've already equipped it, which they have most of the time. So right now, I don't think this is that good, but if stealing an artifact becomes powerful, this is definitely one, worth bearing in mind for your sideboard going forwards. Next up, we've got Fire Inscription, which is a pretty scary enchantment, right? So the ring tempers you when at ETB, so it does give you some value immediately, but the main thing you're interested in here is that it deals 2 damage to each opponent whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, which you don't want to be running this in burn, really. I think you want to be running this in either a Storm deck or just a very cantrip-heavy deck, right? You could run this in something like, is it Phoenix or is it Wizards? Now, having said that, those sorts of decks typically don't want 3-mana enchantments, so it is kind of expensive, which makes me think it might not see play, but if you want a damage payoff for just chaining a bunch of instants or sorceries together, this seems like a pretty powerful payoff for doing that. So again, doesn't really have a home right now, but I think there could be some deck in future that wants to use this as like a win condition, basically. The next time we've got Nazgûl, which is a really interesting card. So initially I wasn't very high on this card, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought it could maybe see play, because the really nice thing about this is that it stacks really well, right? You play the first one and you get the ring tempts you, then you get the first bonus. If you then play a second one, it triggers like on top of it. So, it stacks really well because it scales very quickly as you get multiples in play. In terms of historic, again, I'm not really confident this is going to see play in historic, but I could envision a deck that runs 9 of these with Collected Company, and then you could run Changelings, like Changeling Outcast alongside Retrofit Foundry, and then if you go Changeling Outcast into this on turn 3, pump this and your Changeling Outcast, then Company into 2 more, then you've got a huge Changeling Outcast that can't be blocked, and if it's your Ring Bearer, you're getting a bunch of value off it as well. So, this does seem at first glance like not very powerful, but I think there's an outside chance that you could run this in like a green-black Collected Company deck. Now, thinking about how that lines up against the rest of the format, not too optimistic this is a real deck, but I think the card is better than it looks initially, basically. Next up, we've got Rally at the Hornburg. So this is basically, another Raise the Alarm. It is sorcery speed, but the reason I brought this up is because of the recent success of the Boros Convoke deck. Now, again, I'm not sure this is going to see play because the more I've experimented in the archetype, I actually think that green-white is better in historic because of I can't remember the name of it now. There's a 2-mana creature that basically gives all of the other creatures in your hand. Oh, it's Ropeline Attendant. That's the name of it. I think green-white Convoke is better in historic because of Ropeline Attendant. So I'm not sure Boros is the way you want to build it in historic, but this seems pretty good if you are going Boros Convoke because it's a red card, so you can cast it off Burning Tree Emissary that also produces white tokens that you can then use to convoke, and gives them haste as well. So if you are interested in trying to port the Pioneer version of Boros Convoke over, this seems like a potentially good addition, especially if you're trying to run Burning Tree Emissary. Then next up we've got Elven Farsight, which is pretty interesting sorcery. So you scry 3, and then if the top card, then you may reveal the top card of your library if it's a creature, draw a card. So you do need to be running a fairly creature-heavy deck for this to hit consistently, but with the Scry, it's fairly likely that you can just turn this into Scry 3, draw a card, and then set up the top of your library. Now again, I'm not too optimistic about this because I think like a card like Abundant Harvest is probably better in most situations and basically sees no play, but I thought this was an interesting card to highlight because these sorts of effects for 1 mana can be good if they fit well with the rest of your deck. The next up we've got Peregrin Took. So this is kind of another food payoff card. So if 1 or more tokens will be created, you create an extra food in addition, and then you can sack 3 foods to draw a card. So again, I talked earlier about how it's already really difficult to fit everything that you want inside the food shell, so I'd be kind of surprised if this made the cut, but it is a pretty powerful effect, right? You could probably make a deck that produces a lot of tokens, and then you get the additional food here. If you're running this alongside Samwise Gamgee, then you can probably produce a ton of food tokens, and then this gives you a payoff for doing that. You can cash them into draw a card, and then if you have this alongside Trail of Crumbs, you sack 3 food to draw a card, and then if you have 3 mana, you can, pay 3 different mana to get 3 Trail of Crumbs triggers. So I'm not optimistic this is going to see play, but if you're going very all in on the food synergies, this does seem like a potential option to run there as well. And then finally, we've got Gandalf's Sanction. So, sorcery that deals X damage to target creature, where X is the number of instants or sorceries in your graveyard, and then excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. So, these sorts of effects, like Beacon Bolt or whatnot, have never really seen play. The main thing I'm excited about this card that makes me think it could see play at some point in future is the excess damage. So, these sorts of effects have always been target creature or planeswalker at best. Never face, but the fact that this can deal excess damage directly to the opponent could mean that you could use this as a finisher, right? If you're playing a deck that has a ton of instances or sorceries in, if you're up against a creature deck and you have, 18 sorceries in your graveyard and use it to pick off a 1/1 and then deal 17 damage directly to the opponent, that's powerful enough that I thought it was worth highlighting. Now, again, there's a lot of issues with this sort of card, right? Graveyard Hate shuts it off. And unlike Beacon Bolt, it's sorcery speed. You don't get the jump start on it either, but I felt like the excess damage does mean you could potentially use it as a finisher at some point, but I don't really think it has a good home right now, but I thought it was worth highlighting anyway. But anyway, that's all the cards that I highlighted for this. I'm really excited for that. There's a ton of cool build-arounds. There's a ton of just generically powerful cards that I think could see a lot of play in the format. I think cards like Reprieve and Flames of Anor are going to have a big impact on the format. I think Bowmasters is a really sick card as well. I'm really excited to play with the Halfling and Devotion, so there's a ton of really cool cards in this set that I'm excited for. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's either cards that I missed out on, because there were a lot of cards that I looked at that were like, this seems like it could be powerful, but I can't really think of the right home for it, for example. Or if I missed any applications of the cards that I talked about, because, sometimes I definitely do miss stuff, but, some cool card interactions that I haven't thought of. So definitely let me know in the comments about that. And let me know what decks you're excited to build with and brew around once the set drops. Either way, once it does, I'm definitely going to be building a ton of different decks, trying to figure out what works, and then hopefully have more deck guides with these cards in soon for sure as well. Like I said, there's going to be an Alchemy set review coming later this week, so hold tight for that. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.